Have you ever stood in front of an ancient castle in Paris or Vienna and marveled at its magnificence, only to suddenly wonder, it's beautiful, sure, but is we going to pay to keep the lights on in 50 years? Europe today is exactly like that castle. On the outside, it remains the symbol of civilization, a luxury summer's vacations, a high-end fashion brands, but inside, down the basement, termites hiding through the foundations, and the economic pillars that once held up the entire continent are cracking. This man holding the megaphone screaming a warnings about the fire smoldering in that basement is none other than Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. Welcome back. Today we aren't talking about the daily news cycle. We are talking about the survival of a civilization. In a bombshell interview with The Economist and six other major European newspapers, President Macron declared a geopolitical and geoeconomic state of emergency.
Pay close attention to the words he used. State of emergency, not a challenge, not a difficulty, but an emergency. He warns that if Europe does not immediately change the blood in its economic veins, the old continent will be swept aside. Swept aside, a term of total destruction, but swept aside by what? By a tsunami of technology from the United States and a flood of cheap goods from China. So, what is the real story here? Why is the continent that once wrote the rules for the entire world now terrified of being eliminated from the game? And will the shock therapy Dr. Macron is prescribing save the European patient, or will it cause a fatal heart attack? Let's open up this medical file and take a look. To understand Macron's fear, we need to start with a concept he calls the Greenland Moment. Imagine you are standing on an ice sheet in Greenland. For decades, you believed this ice was eternal. But then, one day, you hear a crack, and then another, and you see the seawater rising around your boots. That is the moment of brutal realization. For Europe, that ice sheet was American protection and cheap Russian energy. For 30 years after the Cold War, Europe lived in a sweet dream. They built their prosperity on cheap gas flowing through Russian pipelines to power factories in Germany, and they relied on the American nuclear umbrella, so they didn't have to spend too much on their own militaries. They believed that trade would turn enemies into friends, that if they bought enough gas from Putin and sold enough cars to Xi Jinping, peace would reign forever. But then, February 2022 happened. Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. The dream shattered, and right after that, another shockwave hit from the other side of the Atlantic. The United States was no longer the generous big brother. Macron points out a chilling reality. Europe is facing an American administration, whether Democrat or Republican, that is acting openly hostile in economic terms. The US wants to re-industrialize its own country, and it isn't afraid to do so by sucking the oxygen out of its allies. This is the geopolitical rapture Macron is talking about. He fears that after the initial shock, Europeans will fall back into a state he calls cowardly relief, meaning, oh, the crisis peaked, energy prices dropped a bit, let's go back to sleep. But if Europe goes back to sleep now, it might never wake up. Let's look at the numbers. Numbers don't lie, and they are telling a horror story. Between 2008 and 2023, the US economy grew by 87%. In that same period, the European economy grew by a meager 13.5%. You didn't mishear that. 8.2% versus 13, the wealth gap between the two sides of the Atlantic is widening faster than ever. In 2008, the economies of the EU and the US were roughly the same size. Today, the US has left Europe in the dust, leading by nearly 50%. If this trend continues, by 2035, the GDP per capita gap between the US and Europe will be as wide as the gap between Japan and Ecuador is today. Europe is becoming an open-air museum, a place where Americans and Chinese come to vacation, to buy Gucci bags, but where no one comes to find the future of technology. And the clearest proof of this collapse isn't in Excel spreadsheets, it's in Ludwigshafen, Germany, the headquarters of BASF, the world's largest chemical company. For over a century, BASF was the beating heart of German industry, the symbol of made in Germany. But recently, they announced thousands of job cuts at home and the closure of several fertilizer and ammonia plants because energy costs were simply too high. Instead, where are they taking 10 billion euros? To China to build a massive new super complex in Zhanjiang. When the heart of German industry begin to migrate to China because it can't survive at home, that is when, Macron's state of emergency is not a joke. So, what are the two vices squeezing Europe right now? Vice number one, the United States and the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. Don't let the name fool you. This is actually a massive subsidy package worth $369 billion, designed to suck green tech companies into the US. America is telling European businesses, come here, we have cheap energy, plenty of land, and we will give you cash the moment you build a factory. The result, Volkswagen, BMW, and a host of European battery companies are scrambling to move production lines to America. Vice number two, China and overcapacity. China is producing far more solar panels, electric vehicles, and wind turbines than the world needs. And as China's domestic economy slows down, where do they dump all that inventory? Europe. Ports in Europe are currently clogged, not because of a lack of containers, but because giant ships from BYD and other Chinese EV makers are docking, offloading thousands of cheap, well-designed, high-tech electric cars. The auto industry, Europe's last great pride, is facing the risk of being swept aside just like the solar panel industry was 10 years ago. Facing this hanging by a thread scenario, President Macron has laid out a blueprint to overhaul Europe based on 4 pillars. Let's dissect each pillar to see the ambition and the paradoxes within them. Pillar 1. Simplification. The war on the paperwork monster. Europe has a superpower that nobody wants. The ability to create the most complex regulations in the world. There is a running joke. The US invents, China builds, and Europe regulates. When ChatGPT was released, the immediate American reaction was to invest billions into OpenAI. What was Europe's reaction? To hurriedly draft an AI Act hundreds of pages long to control it. Macron realizes the absurdity of this. He wants to simplify everything. He argues that if a startup in France wants to sell products to Germany, they face 27 different tax codes, languages, and labor regulations. Meanwhile, a company in California can sell to all 50 US states instantly. That is why Europe has no Google, no Amazon, and perhaps never will if this doesn't change. Pillar 2. Diversification. Never fully trust anyone. The lesson of Russian gas was painful. Macron wants to ensure Europe doesn't repeat that mistake with the US or China. He wants Europe to be sovereign over critical assets, from semiconductors and pharmaceuticals to cloud computing. Right now, the data of European citizens and the trade secrets of European companies are sitting on servers owned by Microsoft and Amazon. If a future US administration decides to pull the plug or use the internet as leverage, Europe would be paralyzed. Macron wants the euro to muscle up, to have its own payment system, so the US can't weaponize the dollar against them. He calls it strategic autonomy. It sounds great, but how do you execute that when the lithium mines are in Australia, the cobalt is in the Congo controlled by China, and the AI technology is in Silicon Valley? Pillar 3. European preference. The flashpoint. This is where the internal war begins. Macron wants to implement a policy that essentially says European tax money must feed European businesses. He proposes hard rules for core industries like steel, defense, and chemicals. For example, if a government wants to buy public buses, they must buy vehicles that have at least 50% or 60% European-made components. He calls it fairness. Why are Chinese EVs subsidized by the Chinese government sold freely in Paris, while French cars can't enter the Chinese market nearly as easily? But Germany, the Netherlands, and the Nordic countries nations that live on exports shudder when they hear this. To them, European preference is just a fancy word for protectionism. They fear that if Europe closes its doors, other countries will retaliate. Mercedes and BMW sell more luxury cars to China than anywhere else. If Europe bans Chinese EVs, Beijing will ban German luxury cars. The German economy would collapse. Furthermore, they argue that protectionism creates zombie companies. If they are protected too comfortably, European firms will become lazy, their prices will rise, and their quality will drop. A consultant from the Eurasia Group noted quite sharply, "Many worry this is just French protectionism dressed up as strategic autonomy. France traditionally loves state intervention, while Germany loves the free market." These two mindsets are currently locking horns like two bulls. Pillar 4. Investment, show me the money. This is the biggest headache. Macron wants massive investment in innovation, defense, and green tech. He cites a 2024 report by Mario Draghi, the former captain who saved the euro. Draghi put forward a number that stunned everyone. Europe needs to invest an additional 800 billion euros per year just to catch up with the US and China. 800 billion. That amount is equivalent to the size of a major national economy. Macron proposed Eurobonds. The idea is that all 27 nations sign together to borrow money to invest, but Germany says absolutely not. The Germans, with a culture of thrift and a fear of inflation that runs in their blood, view joint debt as a sin. They are terrified that the money of hardworking Germans will be used to pay off the debts of their neighbors in the south, like Italy or France, who spend more freely. The pre-summit meeting between Germany, Italy, and Belgium before the official gathering was a subtle slap in the face to Macron. It sent a message. We need to talk privately to rein in your enthusiasm. And we cannot ignore the story of defense, where Europe's weakness is most nakedly exposed. Macron wants Europe to defend itself. But what is the reality? Look at the continent's arsenal. It looks like a potluck dinner where nothing matches. According to recent statistics, Europe operates 178 different types of weapon systems. The US, they have about 30. Europe has 12 different types of battle tanks. The US relies on one main type, the Abrams. This fragmentation is a logistical nightmare. When war breaks out, how do you find spare parts for 12 different tanks at the same time? And worse, when European countries decided to increase defense budgets after the Ukraine war started, where did they take that money? 63% of it flowed straight into the pockets of American defense contractors. They bought F-35s from Lockheed Martin. They bought Patriot missiles from Raytheon. They didn't buy the Rafale from France or the Eurofighter from Germany. Macron is trying to salvage the situation with the Future Combat Air System FCAS project in cooperation with Germany and Spain. This is the ambition to build a sixth-generation fighter jet connected to a combat cloud and drones. But this project has been delayed for years because Dassault France and Airbus Germany are fighting over who controls the technology. While Europe argue over who builds the wings and who builds the engine, the US has already test flown its sixth-generation aircraft. That is the tragedy of division. Macron insists the project is alive, but many military experts just shake their heads. Clearly, Macron is in a difficult position. At home, his popularity is sliding. He no longer holds a majority in parliament, and the far-right faction of Marine Le Pen is rising strong with populist anti-EU slogans. Macron's time at the Élysée Palace is now counted in months, and he himself has contradictions that annoy his allies. On one hand, he calls for trade diversification and expanding relations with the global south. On the other hand, he is the one who blocked the EU-Mercosur free trade agreements with South American countries in January 2024. Why? Because he was afraid of French farmers protesting against cheap beef from Brazil. You see, even the most ardent cheerleader for globalization like Macron has to bow to domestic political pressure. This makes his words on the international stage lose weight. South American countries look at this and say, Europe just wants to sell stuff to us, but they don't want to buy anything from us. But despite all these contradictions and arguments, there is one truth that no one, not even those who hate Macron the most, dares to deny. He is right about the diagnosis. Europe is too slow, too old, and too naive. Macron fears that Europe will die not a physical death, but a death of status. Europe will become a second-tier continent, a bystander watching the US and China shape the world, a place left with nothing but a glorious past to chew on. Recently, Macron sent his diplomatic advisor to Moscow to probe Putin's intentions. The result brought back was a big fat zero. Russia is not interested in peace. Russia believes time is on its side and that Europe is too weak to sustain a long game. This only reinforced Macron's belief. If Europe doesn't grow teeth and claws, no one will bother talking seriously to them. Today's story leaves us with a massive question, not just for Europe, but for the world. Can an aging democracy with a complex consensus-making process between 27 different nations possibly race against centralized, decisive superpowers like China or the US? Macron is trying to turn the clumsy cargo ship named Europe into an agile battleship. It is a mission that is nearly impossible. But as he said, the price of doing nothing is extinction. We must wake up or we will disappear. What about you? What do you think? Can Europe survive this Greenland moment, smash through the ice of stagnation, and be reborn? Or are we witnessing the final chapters of the era of Western dominance? And what is the lesson here for other nations, perhaps like Vietnam or other mid-sized economies striving to rise in the global value chain while caught between great powers? The lesson might be never depend too much on one market and never stop innovating. Please share your perspective in the comments below. I really want to hear your thoughts on this chessboard of the century. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you in the next deep dive analysis.